Okay. Hoping we are live. Should be. And just pray that this stream integrity stays where it is. I don't have quite the upload speed at home, I think. But that's okay. Cool. Thanks, Chris. I am going to do my best to kind of stay tuned in for comments and questions this morning, if you guys have those. And hope that'll work out. And I'm also going to check things on my own phone here to see what we can see. Okay. Chris says it looks good so far. If anybody is out there in the Nestosphere, chime in, please, and let us know that you're here. And we're going to get started. Normally we do have like a little prayer time before we get started, but what I'm going to do this time is save that for the end. And if there are any prayer requests that you can think of, maybe put those in the live chat, and then we can offer a prayer at the end of class for that very purpose, or those purposes, actually. So I'm in the bedroom. In fact, I'm going to go close the door for the sake of sound. So just a sec. There we go. And the girls are in another bedroom, sort of our little catch-all room, and we hope that maybe things are streaming okay over there for them on the Facebook page. Well, actually, they're doing it from Melanie's page and then trying to share it through our Facebook group. So hopefully all of that is going well. But that's kind of our setup here at the Wheat House this morning. So what we're going to do is go ahead and jump in. Oh, hi, Michelle. We're going to jump in to Ruth. And depending on what I look like in this little picture up here, we may change that depending on how things go. So we were in chapter 2 last week, and I kind of rushed a little bit at the end to at least read the rest of the text of chapter 2. And I'm just going to read verses 21 through 23 to launch us off right now. So chapter 1, we got Naomi, widowed. We've got the story of her two daughters-in-law choosing to remain with her despite the loss of their own husbands. And then one of them chooses to stay in Moab. Ruth chooses to remain with Naomi, comes back to Israel with her. So remember, Ruth is not an Israelite, she's a Moabite, but she pledges her loyalty in such a way that it's really a proselytizing statement that she makes in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, indicating that she will take on the full identity of an Israelite, their God, their people, their land. She's not even going to go back home to be buried. She wants to be buried wherever Naomi is. And so that's a wonderful statement of loyalty, and that's been the key theme for us so far, is that chesed, covenant, faithfulness, loyalty that God has towards us, and that he hopes and prays that we have towards him. Naomi and Ruth return to Bethlehem, and this whole study has been based on that idea of the Bethlehem Road, the idea that we have to take a long journey back from our grief and pain and sorrow and loss. And so this would mimic the journey that Naomi and Ruth take back to prosperity in Bethlehem. They come at the beginning of the barley harvest at the end of chapter 1, which is perfect timing for what God has in store for Ruth in particular, and Naomi by extension. Chapter 2 is where we talked last week about Ruth coming to glean in the field of a particularly worthy man, a knight-like figure, a knight in shining armor named Boaz. And when she goes in to glean. We suggested that there may have been some level of impropriety. It's hard to tell from the text, but at least there was the threat of possible racial slurs given towards her, or some kind of bigotry, or some kind of possibly even physical abuse that could have come her way because of the nature of the beast at that time. This is the time of the judges. This is the time when people did what was right in their own hearts, and so it's very easy for us to see that Boaz has set himself apart in this situation. He is unlike any other man, and so he suggests that she glean along with his young women. He even goes so far as to invite her to drink from the water that has been drawn by the men who are serving in his field, which goes counterculture. He even allows her to come and have the meal at midday with him, and he offers her food from his own hand. So there's an instant attraction. I don't know if it was love at first sight per se, but at least there is a willingness for Boaz to see her beyond her position. And I think that's, again, speaks well to his character. And then, like we said at the end of chapter 2, she gleaned a great deal. She got to take a lot of that home, and then was able to come back and gather for the next 7 weeks, to the point where the scholars say that she probably had enough food for her and Naomi for the rest of the year. Now, that sounds good at first, and it is good, but that does leave us wondering, well, what happens after that? Does she really have enough? And so we suggested, of course, there's the basketfuls on the screen. I hope you can see that, that she had plenty of food. But let's go ahead and talk about just a couple of things as we wrap up chapter 2, some talking points. One of those things is how we can see God's character expressed here. Before I talk about that, like Boaz, the chesed love, that steadfastness and loyalty that we've been talking about, it cannot be a respecter of persons. That's a key thing for the love that we show. That's Christ-like love, which is the love that Boaz has. That chesed must not be a respecter of persons or places, because, again, she's a Moabite, she's a woman, she's servant level in society. He is none of those things, but he shows her kindness, despite all those things that would normally stop people, especially in their society, from showing that kind of kindness. And then the place that she's in, this is not the societal area where that kind of kindness is shown. This is a work day. This is a production value kind of day. And yet Boaz stops all those things to show her that unlikely kindness in the workplace. And really, even for us, I think, that's one of those places where we don't expect to find kindness in the workplace. And so wouldn't it be wonderful for us to clothe ourselves with that kind of kindness, because it's God's character that we see in that kindness. 1 John chapter 4, I'm going to turn to that and read to you guys. 1 John chapter 4, and looking at verse 19. We're going to be in 1 John quite a bit today with our sermon as well. 1 John chapter 4, verse 19. Why do we love? We love because he first loved us. This is a reciprocal love. This is the love that has been shown unto us that we then show unto others. The parable of the unforgiven servant that we read in our sermon time last week flashes up once again in my mind as I think about the reciprocal nature of mercy and forgiveness. And that's exactly what is being expressed here by Boaz, a willingness to say, hey, I'm dependent on God, so I'm going to show that love and kindness towards someone like Ruth and Naomi. I'm sure he had Naomi in mind as well. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32 says, be kind to one another. Be kind. I showed some videos, and I need to post some more of them here on our Facebook group from a friend of mine named Richard, who grew up in New Zealand and then went to school at Freed Hardman with me. And he's just one of those really punny guys. He loves a good pun. And so he's been doing these videos that are puns, and yet they are these moments where he takes a passage of Scripture and shows us ways to be kind, just simple ways to be kind. If we could all just be as kind and considerate and thoughtful and tender-hearted and forgiving of one another as God in Christ forgave you, Ephesians 4:32. So that's the character of God and the quality of God that we need to take with us, that we can see very clearly in this story right now. Wouldn't our relationships be richer if we were better reflectors of God's image? Who outside your circle or below your circumstances needs to be able to see that kind of kindness shown to them from God, but through us? And then when expressing his kindness, this kind of kindness, Boaz doesn't draw attention to himself. He's so self-deprecating in this situation. And we have that tendency when we show kindness to, take the social media picture, the selfie, and show everybody what we're doing. Hey, I'm giving food to the poor. It's not wrong for us to do that. I don't know, that we should worry too much about that. But here we are. Matthew chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. Do we practice our righteousness to be seen by others? Can we claim to be as willing to move the credit to God the way that Boaz has done? Boaz is a beautiful shadow of Christ, showing compassion and generosity. And Christ shows that to us. Boaz spoke kindly to Ruth, and Jesus spoke kindly to those that are trapped in sin and sorrow. So it's a tremendous blessing to be able to see how Boaz reacts in this situation. So I'm going to stop for a minute. Ooh, cool. Hi, John, Susan, maybe Jordan. Picture in picture. Yes, Chris. Cool. Let's see. Okay, cool. If anybody else is listening, please chime in and let us know you're here. I will try to check from time to time and as we continue our study. Okay, so Jesus speaks kindly to us. It's like he sees us down in the dumps and sort of lifts our heads and invites us to labor and meal and have a meal with him and serve with him. And Jesus serves us himself. John 13 stoops to wash his disciples' feet. At the Lord's Supper, we're reminded of his grace and his love and his desire for fellowship when we see those pictures and those images. So when we are there at the supper, as we will be later this morning, we can regularly taste and see that the Lord is good. Psalm 34 and verse 8. So Naomi and Ruth's hope lay in multiple places or directions, you might say, because the hope that they experienced lay actually in past revelation. We tend to think of our hope as future, and it is. They had hope for the future, but why did they have that hope? Because of a past revelation. There's providence in place, not just for their future, but it came from their past. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, there is this provision put in place. Let me go there for just a sec. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. And if you guys see the wildebeest fighting behind me, that's not symbolic of our class this morning, okay? We're not going to have battles online this morning in class time, all right? This is so great. I don't get to hear any laughter at all. It's normal. So my jokes will either fall or they won't fall, and I'll laugh internally, and it'll all be okay. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. It says, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribes. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing." And so then verse 19, he tells them, "Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him, and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you the great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons, and now the Lord God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven." So Moses, highlighting for the Israelites what God had done for them, the providence in the past. And so God puts some laws in place that we've talked about, in particular the law of gleaning of the fields that we talked about last week in chapter 2, puts that in place as providence for Ruth and Naomi's situation. So again, we get the benefit of connecting the dots, thousands of years later, to see what God has put in place. And that should give us hope for the future ourselves. God has providence put in place for us. So God had the foresight to mandate their preservation with mechanisms under the law. And so you can see a number of scriptures on the screen there for you to check if you'd like to. But in the midst of grief, in the midst of pain, we want to ask the question, where is God? What is he doing? God's presence is never more powerfully felt than in our obedience. Our willingness to continue to stay with him and obey him. So this is a call for the church, for the body of Christ, to be the answer to that question. Where's God? If others could see him in our obedience, maybe they would understand God better. In a morally relative society, how can we adequately fulfill our charter to be God's people? Galatians chapter 6 talks about bearing others' burdens. It talks about doing good unto all men, especially to the household of faith. Don't forget the all people part of that, the all mankind part of that. So give me just a moment. I'm going to slide over to another outline here for chapter 3. And I see Randy has joined us. Hello, Randy. And that's great. Okay, so in chapter 3, let's see. There we go. And let me see if I can slide us along in the PowerPoint here. Yeah, chapter 3 is an interesting title in my mind. And again, I think I've told you guys, hold on. I told you about my friend Michael who put this study together. He has dealt with tremendous grief in his life. Lost his father in a pretty freak accident at home while Michael and I were in college. And then just a few years ago, they lost their little boy, who was only about 2.5 years old. And so his journey through grief has been difficult and continual. And he did our online grief workshop back in March last year. And I hope you guys got to watch those videos because he really does pour out for us some important thoughts on grief literacy, understanding how to help people in their grief and how to just be present, because there's so many things that we would normally want to say that we probably shouldn't say. But in the moment of grief and in the struggle of grief, we tend to look in very binary terms, either or terms, zero-sum game. When it comes to how God operates. He's either there or he's not there. And we see Naomi saying, God's hand is out against me. And the reality is that God and his sovereignty works in tandem with us. You guys ever ride a bike and try to, we did this when I was a kid, try to see how far you could go on just one pedal? You pedal forward with just one side and see just how far you can coast along before you have to, start again and get the other pedal going. That's a little bit of our mindset with God. Is we think, well, either I'm going to pedal by myself and be self-reliant, or I'm just going to sit there and coast and let God do the pedaling. Well, the realization needs to be there for us that there's two pedals. And we push the one, God pushes the other. At least that's the way I can kind of see it unfolding here in the book of Ruth. All right, let me slide this back over. Okay. So in chapter 3, how far can you ride a bike using only one pedal? I can't do it very long. But that's part of our struggle. How do we explain the enigmatic relationship between God's actions and our actions? On God's side of things in the story of Ruth so far, he's visited Israel, ending the famine, beckoning Naomi home just at the right time, at harvest time, and he's likely directed Ruth to glean in Boaz's field rather than someone else's field. And so you can see God is pushing his pedal in those situations. But at the same time, you have to look at Naomi. Naomi took the initiative to return home. Whether it was just overwhelming grief, whether it's the news that she heard that God had visited, whatever it is that brings her home, she took the initiative. She could have ignored those signals. She could have not chosen to move on. Ruth obviously is our key character when it comes to initiative. She took the initiative to follow her, and then the initiative to go and glean in the fields because she knew that was the only way they were going to live in this situation. And then Boaz. Boaz took initiative to show unexpected kindness to Ruth. So working together is what propelled the story forward. Ruth and Naomi still had a long-term problem, as we see at the end of chapter 2. And so Naomi decides to, again, use initiative and get involved by coaching Ruth on how to approach Boaz, and we'll see that here in a minute. God's involvement is difficult to discern at first glance. But how else are we supposed to explain how the plan started to unfold so successfully? Boaz acts just as Naomi predicts. He responds favorably to Ruth, and there was a pretty high probability of scandal or failure at this point. I forgot to grab my little book. I'm going to read you a quote from that. I even put the page numbers in the outline for myself this time. Yeah. Says, this is from Block. He's one of the commentators we've been reading. The reader stands back in awe, wondering what has possessed Ruth. Here is a servant demanding... before I read that, let's get our context. I'm sorry. Ruth chapter 3. Let's read a little bit from this. Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, All that you say, I will do. So, again, with a little bit of that context in mind, it seems like this is not likely to actually happen. Here's a servant demanding that the boss marry her, a Moabite making the demand of an Israelite, a woman making the demand of a man, a poor person making the demand of a rich man. Was this an act of a foreigner, a naive foreigner, or a daughter-in-law's devotion to her mother-in-law, or another sign of the hidden hand of God? From a natural perspective, the scheme was doomed from the beginning as a hopeless gamble, and the responsibility Naomi placed on Ruth was quite unreasonable. But it worked. That's the amazing thing about this story. So God has no business being anyone's co-pilot, But that's what we tend to do, is we often run ahead of God thinking, well, if I don't do something, it won't happen. God has no business being anybody's co-pilot. We need to get out of his way. But aren't there times, as we're understanding now, that there are also places where he expects us to act? He expects us to be part of the equation and expects us to do something. James chapter 2. James chapter 2. Let's find James. And let's look at verse 17. James chapter 2, verse 17. So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is what? It's dead. It is inactive. It's no longer living. It can't do anything. It doesn't have power. It doesn't have legs, so to speak. Verse 26. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. We may have all the faith in the world. We may believe that God's doing something. We may believe that God is capable and has all the power. But there's still this expectation that our faith is active. Our faith has to do something. So do we just expect divine providence to arrive on our doorstep as a gift-wrapped item? When it doesn't, then we we do feel that God has forsaken us, don't we? Or maybe he's out to get us, like Naomi felt. It would do us good to remember there's a second pedal on the bike. So you think about those first 5 verses we just read. Naomi wanted to secure Ruth's future. She wants things to go well for her. And that was true back in chapter 1, verse 9. If Naomi died in the near future, Ruth would be in a precarious position as a Moabite widow in Israel. She would be in trouble. She gave Ruth very specific instructions. She says, wash, perfume, and put on some special garments. And it's interesting because the sequence there, depending on which scholars you read, of course, indicates the possibility of preparations that a bride might make for a wedding ceremony. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 3, and verses 12 through 14, is one of those places where there's, and actually chapter 4, verses 11 through 16, she says, I've washed, I've perfumed, I've prepared, for the wedding ceremony and what follows. And so it lends itself to that in that situation, but maybe also this kind of washing and perfuming and preparing yourself and putting on special clothes also indicates the possibility of signifying that mourning is over, the mourning period, the grief period. According to their culture, anyway, we don't really have something quite like that, which I'm glad for, because the reality is grief goes on in a number of different ways. But 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 20, David, when he's mourning and grieving over the death of his son, the child of Bathsheba, after all that sin, that's what he finally has to wake up and do. Is he washes when the child dies. He washes and prepares himself to move on. So maybe perhaps the two concepts aren't mutually exclusive. This is a couple of things that are happening here, but that's about as far as we can go. The threshing floor, an interesting place to be. The threshing floor. Oh, there's the sequence. Sorry, guys. Let me leave that up for a minute, and then we'll move on. The threshing floor was a place of hard-packed earth or a large, smooth rock, depending on the topography. And it's a place where they would bring their grain in stalks, long stalks, and they would toss them up in the air with a winnowing fork, kind of a pitchfork type item. And as they toss them up in the air onto these flat, hard surfaces, the chaff, the extra pieces that were not part of what they needed for the grain, would fly away in the wind. They'd usually do this in the evening, and there's usually a nice breeze, and do it on a place where there's a little bit of a hilltop, so it hits the breeze just right, and take that chaff away. Psalm 1 is a good place to go for an interesting picture there. And so that's what's going on here. So the threshing floor, Hosea 13:3 has another interesting allusion to the threshing floor, what God does when he is judging. Anyway, Boaz, though, likely slept nearby the threshing floor to protect the harvest from potential thieves and animals, and also the possibility of resuming work early in the morning without having to go all the way home. All right, so now let's jump right into the thick of it here. The feet, right? I put that in quotation marks because, I'm going to have to shrink myself on the screen here because I'm in the way. But that's okay. You don't really need to see me. You need to see what we're talking about here. Okay, is the word feet there a euphemism? So we'll get back to that passage. Let's go back to Ruth. Chapter 3. Okay, yeah, verse 4. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So the question comes, is feet a euphemism for something else? And there's not really enough evidence to indicate that possibility, although they kind of use it that way in other places. This word, let's see if I got that on the screen. No, I don't think we did. This word is... And I don't know how to pronounce this in Hebrew. There's one that looks like margalo, and there's one that looks like regalim. No, it's not that one. It's the regalum word, and it's just an uncovering of his feet. It literally means his feet. Daniel chapter 10 verse 6 is another place where that is used. And so again, you guys will have this recorded now, so you can see the slides. And if you want these slides, I can send them to you, and you can get these pictures. Or hey, order the book. Michael's book is good. If you want to kind of do more research on that point, I don't want to belabor it, but that's not really the likelihood. It was still at least highly suggestive, of course, for a man and a woman to be lying next to each other at night in this particular situation. So there's scandal possibilities still at play, but it's not just a clear-cut, simple, dirty thing going on here. Okay. Before we get to that, then the other question is, okay, uncover. That word, is that a euphemism for some kind of sexual thing? And so again, we have some places in the Old Testament where at least there's an indication for some kind of sexual reference, but nothing this simple and clear cut. And so the context, and you guys hear me talk about this all the time, the context is key in these kinds of situations. There may be some situations where the idea of uncovering someone's feet was an actual reference to to sexual activity or genitalia or something like that. Okay, but the context here is not pushing us that direction. We as human beings kind of allow ourselves to go that way very quickly, but the context doesn't suggest a blatant sexual act. Hosea chapter 9 verse 1, check that one out too. Okay, so I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about the tawdry possibilities, but just understand that there's a little bit of potential, but not much potential for something like that going on here. Please do your own research on that, and feel free to challenge me. It's okay to challenge me on these things. Actually, it's okay to challenge me on anything. Okay, now, part of the reason we struggle with that whole dichotomy is that modern love stories have to have at least one sex scene in them in order to be worth anything in our society. But not this time, not in this story. That's not the direction that we have to go, and the text doesn't have to lead us that direction. It doesn't. Ruth did exactly as Naomi instructed. That's all she's doing. She's following, just as she said she would, following the way that Naomi suggested would put them in the proper position. And like we said, it works. So Ruth did exactly as Naomi instructed. She presented herself as a humble petitioner, and then you got you got to deal with Boaz. The midnight surprise. How alarming it must have been for Boaz in that situation to suddenly wake up and see this woman lying there at his feet. How do you react to being awoken in the middle of the night? How about you guys? Ooh. Some of us are shoot first, ask questions later. Some of us are doing the who am I? Where am I? What happened? What is this place? Certainly his thought could have been, is it a thief? Is there an animal attacking? Am I going to have to go all, it would be his great-grandson. Am I going to have to go all David on this animal and tear it apart? That fight or flight response would have kicked in, I'm sure. But once his wits are about him and he realizes what's going on here, then she's able to speak her request. And it's interesting the way that the request comes across, because, or even like a proposal, you might say, she spoke her request that he spread his wings over her like a garment. Does that sound familiar, guys? Last week, we said this. This was essentially a marriage proposal. By the context, there's some indicators there in those verses I just put on the screen. But she basically repeated almost verbatim what he said back in chapter 2, verse 12. Do you want to read that again? Chapter 2, verse 12. He said, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And so she has this same thing in mind. Oh, shoot, I haven't read the verses. Chapter 3, verse 6. I was going to do that. chapter 3, verse 6. I've read it a couple of times this morning, but you guys haven't read it with me yet. Chapter 3, verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, Who are you? And she said, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So, there you go. Now you have maybe a better understanding of what I've just been talking about. But she basically repeats verbatim the blessing that he had spoken back in chapter 2, verse 12. She's asking him to be the answer to his own prayer, to his own blessing, to be the second pedal. You know, we can't discount Ruth's courage and the risk that she was taking. I mean, that is most definitely a piece of what's going on here. I want to read to you another quote. This is from a author called, his last name's Younger. But he says, for example, Boaz could mock her request for marriage to him, a wealthy and powerful Israelite landowner, as a vain attempt at social climbing for a poor widowed Moabite, a gold digger idea. Or, since Ruth has not secured a new marriage contract and is technically still the wife of Mahlon, Boaz could charge her with failing in her family responsibilities, branding her an adulteress. Or even worse, Boaz could use the night's opportunity for his sexual pleasure, bringing on her greater humiliation, and then malign her, charging her with entrapment, or even charge her with prostitution. Just share those things to note the stakes and how brave it was for Ruth to step into this situation and to try to change their stars, so to speak. But like I said, a verbatim repetition of the blessing, and it spoke of her character. At least in Boaz's eyes, and of course ours as well. Now, we read chapter 2, verse 1. We already know the character of Boaz. He is a worthy man. And he chose not to put on Barry White and get the champagne and make his move in this situation. So he's still a worthy man. And instead of doing those things, he calls attention to her character. And he says to her there in chapter 3, verse 13, you are a worthy woman. The kindness that you do me is greater than the kindness that is done before. You know, you could have gone after younger men. You could have done a variety of different things, but you have chosen to stay true. And so that's just tremendous to see that positive character in Ruth as well. This is consistent with what we know about Boaz. He responded, again, with this chesed kind of mercy, love, loyalty. And she called upon him as Redeemer. That word is used a couple of times. It's chapter 2, verse 20, and then chapter 3, verse 9 that we just read. It occurs 9 times in the whole book as a noun and 12 times as a verb. It's goel. You may have heard that word before, and that's a butchering of the pronunciation. But the goel was one who was supposed to use his resources to help his clan when his clan was in need. And that could have been anybody in his clan. And there was an assumption of sort of corporate solidarity in their society when it came to things like this. Here's another quote for you. This is from Block. It says, as a kinship term, it denotes the near relative who is responsible for the economic well-being of a relative, and he comes into play especially when the relative is in distress and cannot get himself or herself out of the crisis. The Israelite provision for the goel is based upon an assumption of corporate solidarity and the sanctity of the family or clan. To offend a relative is to offend oneself. the custom of redemption was designed to maintain the wholeness and health of family relationships even after the person has died. And I know that in our culture we don't do things quite this way, but wouldn't it be great if we had some things in place to help us with that corporate solidarity, with that family identity? Because, as we can look around and see, families are falling apart all over, and there's a lack of that cohesion in families. And maybe it's in part because we've lost some of the tradition. And remember, we did a lesson on traditions not terribly long ago, and usually they're put in place for a good reason. They degrade over time, but if we can go back to that original reason why they were put in place and then maybe adapt them to our situation, those traditions might still be valid. But that's what's going on here. And so it's great that they have this concept. And so he's able to step in potentially in this situation. Owning land in Palestine was important to the Israelites. They were allotted a particular amount of land when they took the promised land. And so you can see that in a variety of different places. Leviticus would be a key spot for that. There you go. There's Goel. And then here's this other term, Levir. So let me see. So God basically gave them land as tenants. That was the idea. So that if they mortgaged their land to pay debts, they were under a sort of a societal pressure and obligation to regain ownership as soon as possible. So a goel seemed to be sort of intertwined with this other term, levir, which is the other idea that she is talking about here. Let's see. I thought I had a better note on that. Anyway, Goel seems to be intertwined with Levir. In Ruth, the levirate marriage custom, which is something you may have heard people talk about, this Levir, that's a Latin term, he would marry his brother's widow to continue the family line if his brother died. Genesis 38 has a situation like that. When a family died out physically, it ceased to exist metaphysically in their culture. So it's quite a natural thing to combine these two, the kinsman redeemer, the goel, with the levir, the levirate marriage idea. It's pretty natural for her and Boaz to put these two things together. Boaz signaled his readiness to be both of those things, but there was a closer relative apparently available, he says in chapter 3, verse 13, and so to hold her, he told her to rest beside him, to prevent potential scandal and shame if she goes sneaking out in the middle of the night, and somebody happens to see her. That's whenever things will get hot. But he says, stay here. We'll stay incognito, and then just before dawn is when she goes on. But his indication, what he's indicating to her is he's willing. He's willing to, with this gesture of hospitality, not just words, actions. He's willing to do this. And is this like any other rom-com or quote chick flick that you've ever seen? Not me. In this romantic short story, we have all these well-rounded characters. There's the possibility of a relationship that will save Ruth and Naomi, but we're kind of left wondering, even here in chapter 3, if they'll actually get together, or will some mysterious person or force come in and foil their plan. And so that's where we're going to leave it this week, and maybe we'll stay a little bit more about chapter 3, but I'm going to read those last few verses. Verse 14. Chapter 3, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another, avoiding the scandal. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it out. And he measured out 6 measures of barley, put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Naomi is confident that this is going to be taken care of. Guys, I've got 10:15 on my clock here, and so let's go ahead and wrap this up. I didn't see any particular prayer requests in the chat, assuming that I'm still seeing everything in the chat. Let me double check here. Yeah, looks like we're good. So let's go ahead and offer a prayer together, and then we will close this out. But stick nearby and look out on the Facebook page for the link again for our worship time. We're going to go set up in the living room with me and the girls and Melanie, and we hope to sing with you and offer some worship to the Lord together via this distanced way. But I think it will be a blessing if you'll stick with us. So please do that here in just a few moments. But let's close together with a prayer, please. Father in heaven, you are truly the great and powerful Chesed love God. We are just so thankful that you have that kind of love for us, a loyalty, a willingness to go beyond convention, to go beyond culture, and to stick with us through thick and thin. Father, we pray that as we've seen in the story of Boaz and Ruth again today, that our bravery and our courage will be like that of Ruth, that our willingness to respond with compassion and mercy and kindness will be like that of Boaz. Please help us, Lord, with these qualities. Please build them in us. Help us to stick close to your word. Help us stick close to your spirit and to you in every situation we encounter. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you for his love and mercy. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, guys. See you here in just a few minutes.